I'm Jonathan, and this is Mapped Learning, a place to learn freely without ads or noise. Let's continue our journey. In this lesson, I want to talk about the fundamentals of cybersecurity. And when I say fundamentals, I specifically mean what is called the CIA Triad. And no, we're not talking about a government organization or the Japanese Yakuza. It is the acronym CIA for cybersecurity. The C stands for confidentiality, the I is integrity, and A is for availability. And we will talk about what those mean as it pertains to cybersecurity in this lesson. So before we move on to exactly what each of those three parts of the triad do as far as it pertains to cybersecurity, there are some foundational concepts and technologies that I would like you to be aware of first. Now, I'm not going to go into any type of detail about these. This is just a preview of things that I will cover later. But I want you to be aware of them right now if you aren't already. So on the left, we have some concepts. We have assets, threats, vulnerabilities, risks, controls, also known as safeguards, attack surface, security posture, defense in depth, and exposure. There are a ton more, but these are the ones that stick out the most. On the right-hand side, we have technologies that either support cybersecurity directly or indirectly. Those are encryption, hashing, authentication, authorization, access control, firewalls, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, also known as IDS or IPS, and then there's logging and monitoring. So I will very briefly cover each of these. The core concepts of cybersecurity and the CIA triad is to protect things. What are we protecting? Well, ideally, we want to protect everything to our best abilities. So when we talk about examples in cybersecurity, we usually have two subjects, two people, Alice and Bob. Why are they Alice and Bob? I don't know. Maybe it's because Alice starts with an A and Bob starts with a B. I don't know. Let's just go with that. So in this graphic, you can see Alice on the left and Bob on the right. And they each have their own computer. In this case, their laptops. Those laptops, since they are networking devices and they communicate, those are called assets. An asset, financially speaking, is something that you own. So cybersecurity is the practice of protecting the things that we own. The lines in this graphic are just to illustrate communication paths. So from Alice to Bob and back, it is insinuated that there are a bunch of different devices in between them that support this network communication. Routers, switches, modems, it could even be wireless, it doesn't matter. But the point in cybersecurity is we want to protect assets from intruders regardless of the method. So when we talk about attack surface, when we look at Alice, her attack surface of that asset is anywhere somebody could infiltrate that asset, that device, whether it be over the network or social engineering, which is the practice of manipulating people into divulging secret information, whether it be by threats or impersonating somebody else. There are tons of different ways that an intruder can try to get information from somebody's assets. So every possible way that an attacker could get information from that asset is called the attack surface. And we are trying to protect that attack surface at all costs. The attack surface can be Alice and all of the stuff that is in her location, and it can be Bob and all the stuff that he owns and is using in his location, and it can also be everything in the lines of communication between the two and between everybody else that's involved in similar communications. The amount of protection as a whole that exists between Alice and Bob and the communication channel, antivirus and firewall rules, and just any type of protective method that is involved in these assets and communications is called the security posture. And you may have heard the old saying, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. In cybersecurity, that is literally true. The whole goal of an attacker is to find the weakest area of cybersecurity and exploit it. So how do we protect that? Well, as I mentioned before, on the asset, we can install antivirus and anti-spam, and we can put a LoJack kind of system on there where it can do GPS tracking. We can encrypt the hard drive. We can enforce Alice and Bob to log into the computer with a username and a password and a thumbprint and a retinal scan. It doesn't matter, but the stronger the security, the stronger the security posture. And even though you may protect everything to the best of your ability, attackers that are willing enough and smart enough will find a way to get the information that they want. Now, in this graphic, we have an attacker at the top of this triangle, and that's the hacker. The hacker is a threat. A threat is something that can cause harm to an asset directly or indirectly. And that is just a threat is a thing. A threat always exists. Even if you lock yourself in a bunker, there's always the threat of attackers. It doesn't matter how well you protect yourself, the threats always exist. And that is what this denotes. The threat is always there. What the attacker or hacker is trying to do is find a vulnerability in the entire communication string of Alice and Bob. Now, a vulnerability is another name for a weakness that can be exploited. And when we talk about exploit, we mean take advantage of. So the possibility of the threat using a vulnerability to successfully attack an asset and gain information is called a risk. Now, this is more advanced cybersecurity terminology, but I'm just going to bring it up very briefly. There are two kinds of risk in cybersecurity. There are quantitative risks and qualitative risks. Qualitative risks are something like high, medium, low. It's a spectrum of somebody's opinions. A quantitative risk is measured using statistical analysis. So when we talk about risk, when I talk about risk in a fundamental way, I'm talking about qualitative risk. So when I say that the hacker is a risk to this organization that Alice and Bob work within, I will say there is a medium risk that their systems will be infiltrated based on their current security posture. Now, the purpose of increasing security is to lower the risk. If you increase the protection, the risk becomes lower. The hacker's skills don't change, the threat still exists, but there are less ways that they can infiltrate the assets. And everything, absolutely everything that we do to try to protect these assets is called a control. And previously, we also called that a safeguard. In cybersecurity, safeguard and control mean the same thing. So we want as many controls as possible to protect our information and our assets from this attacker. Now, as a whole, every vulnerability that exists in this network communication example is called your risk exposure. How much of your stuff are you exposing to an attacker? So let's say your company doesn't do business on the internet. Well, you have lowered your risk because you're not on the internet, so you have a smaller risk exposure. However, a company like Microsoft or Google or Amazon, they are global. Their risk exposure is massive. So they have to invest millions and millions of dollars all the time to protect all of their assets. Now, the core fundamentals of understanding the CIA triad is understanding the delicate balance between the three. In an absolutely perfect world, we would have everything 100% connected. But there is another adage out there, kind of a joke. If you want a computer that is absolutely 150% unhackable, well, take that computer, unplug it from power, and bury it in the dirt. That's kind of what we're talking about if we want to do absolute security. However, what happens if we take that computer and bury it in the dirt? It's useless, right? There are things that prevent us from using it, like the Earth. So, what does that mean in cybersecurity terms? Well, we have in a few slides, I will go over what each of these mean. But for now, just understand confidentiality means keeping things secret. Integrity is keeping things authentic. You know what it is. And availability is, can I use it when I need it? And we all know we don't live in a perfect world. There is no such thing as 100% security. If there were, logically, we wouldn't be able to use anything. Everything would be so protected, nobody would be able to use it. So I have some examples here that show the give and take between these three relationships. In this box, I have confidentiality highlighted. If you increase the amount of secrecy, if you increase the amount of secrecy that you put on an asset, then you are going to slightly decrease the amount of integrity, and you are going to more, it's not really the word I want to use, but you will increase you will increase the impact to availability. So the availability will go down. And the reason why is because adding confidentiality, adding secrecy adds time. And the more time it takes to unsecret something, unhide something, the, the less availability it has. Now, in this box on the right, I've highlighted integrity. And integrity is making sure things are authentic, meaning if I send you something in the mail, let's say I write you a letter and I send it in the mail or an email, it doesn't matter, but I send you something and I tell you, hey, I'm sending you something. When you get it, I would like you to tell me what it says. So maybe you'll call me on my phone and you'll say, hey, I got your letter. This is what it says. When you repeat it back to me and I read my copy that I know that I sent you, I'm verifying the integrity. I'm making sure that it didn't change while it was being sent to you. That's the concept of integrity. So if I increase the integrity, I am going to slightly lower the confidentiality, and additionally, I am going to slightly lower the availability. And then finally, with if I increase the availability, and this is really important to understand as far as availability goes. Remember that I said availability is being able to access the data that you need when you need it. So if you try to get to a website and the site's down, the availability isn't there. So if you increase the amount of availability, depending on the amount of availability that you increase it by, you are going to lower the confidentiality. And let me give you an example. Let's pretend that I have a safe with a combination lock. Okay, it has one of those turn locks. And inside of it, I put jewelry. Okay. Now, I am the only person that knows the combination to that safe to get inside. So the availability of the contents of the safe to me is only blocked by that combination. However, if something happens to me negatively, I go outside and I get hurt and I'm not well, I have to go to the hospital or whatever. Well, what is the availability of the contents of the safe if I'm the only one that knows the combination? Well, there is no availability. Nobody would be able to open it. So I want to increase the availability. So I tell my combination to a friend of mine, somebody that I trust, or a family member, pick your person. Well, I have increased the availability because one more person can open that safe. But what happened to the confidentiality? How secret are the contents of the safe? I've increased the amount of people that can access the contents of the safe from one person to two. And that is exactly the concept of availability as it pertains to confidentiality. And of course, we are also going to slightly impact integrity. So These are not exact, and you can have different ways that they impact each other, but this is just a very rough outline of what happens in reality. Now, confidentiality. When we talk about confidentiality, we're talking about encryption. And what do we mean by encryption? What does that do? Well, if you understand the word encrypt, it means to code something. And when we code, say, a file, what we're doing is we are scrambling the contents into what's called a cipher. Okay. So a cipher is a scrambled bunch of characters that represent the data that I want. So the whole point that I want to get you to understand with encryption right now, as it is in this fundamental lesson, is that when you encrypt something, you can decrypt it. Okay? Now, when we talk about encrypting, there are two types, symmetric and asymmetric. And for this example, we're going to use keys. And I am a horrible artist, so I am not going to draw a key. Instead, I will do, you know, key A, key B, whatever. So with symmetric encryption, symmetric means same. So if I use key A to encrypt a file, that same key will decrypt it. Okay? Just like with the combination lock on the safe, I use one combination to lock it and one combination to open it. And I have these symmetric algorithms written down. I'm not going to explain them yet. That's going to be for a future lesson. But I just wanted to make you aware of there are different types of encryption to choose from. Excuse me. And for the government, down at the bottom here, we have this acronym NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That will be on a test. Well, it would be on a certification test, but I'm not going to test you unless you want me to. But that is a nonprofit organization that works very closely with the government. And here we see AES. That is the Advanced Encryption Standard. You don't need to know that right now. But this is the encryption that is used to encrypt secret and top secret information. So just so you know that. Asymmetric encryption, on the other hand, asymmetric meaning different. If I have key A that encrypts the data, key B will decrypt it. How does it work? Well, the people that it created asymmetric encryption are much smarter than I am. In fact, this first encryption algorithm you see, RSA, stands for the last names of the cryptographic scientists that created the first asymmetric algorithm. And it's Revest, Shamir, and Edelman. Man, I'm glad I remembered that. But anyway, they created this standard back, I think, in the 70s. So, and all three of them have PhDs. They own the patent for RSA and they license it out. And they are still alive and doing cybersecurity research. It's actually pretty amazing. For the government, they use the digital signature algorithm for asymmetric encryption. How this works? is very complicated, but I promise I will cover it in a different lesson. Integrity, when I said making sure things are authentic. When when we talk about integrity, we're talking about hashing. And no, I'm not talking about the hashtag hashing. And I'm not talking about the illegal substance. No. Hashing means that you are scrambling data in just like encryption, we're scrambling the contents of the data into a form that we can't read. But here's the difference, and this is extremely super important to distinguish between confidentiality and integrity. When you encrypt something for confidentiality, you can decrypt it. But when you hash something for integrity, you cannot unhash it. Okay? Think of hashing as taking a file and putting it in a blender, and it just has a bunch of different pieces in the end. That's what hashing does. Well, you may think, well, what's the purpose of that? If I can't recompile it, what does it mean? Well, what these hashing algorithms do is let's say I have a file that is text, it says ABC, okay? And I put it through one of these hashing algorithms. Well, what that mathematical function is going to do is it is going to turn those three characters into a fixed length series of bits. And if you remember from my previous IPv4 lesson, a bit is just on or off. It's uh, uh, the smallest size of data. So if I were encrypting, I might encrypt it to CAB. Okay, it doesn't matter. But when you encrypt something, it's the same size at the beginning and the end. When you hash something, depending on the algorithm, it is always going to be a specific length. Okay, so for example, if you see in this second row, I have the algorithm called Haval, and it stands for hash variable length. Okay, and you see where it says variable length. Okay, but here's the thing: if I use the Haval algorithm on a file and I specify the length, okay, it is going to give me a resulting hash that is that many bits in length. Let's just call it 128. Okay, you have a 128 bits, and they're just going to be on and off in a particular way. In order to validate that hash, I am going to tell somebody else what hashing algorithm I used. I'm going to send them this hash, and it doesn't matter how. I can send it as a letter, I can send it in an email, I can tell them over the phone. It's completely public information, okay? But the fact that I used a specific algorithm, they can use that algorithm in the same way, Haval 128, and get the same result. Okay. I give them the original file, I give them the hash, and then they can verify it on their own. And where might you see this? Well, if you've ever downloaded an application from a trusted website, hopefully you're doing it from a trusted website. And yes, I will teach you how to figure out if a website is trusted or not. A lot of times you will see here is the download link and here is the hash, or you may have seen it as a checksum. Okay, those words are interchangeable. Hash and checksum mean the same thing. And that's exactly what it is. And you might see it as a series of numbers and letters, and that is 99% of the time, that is how hashes are represented. So I'm not going to go over this table. You can see it on my Substack. I have it in there as a PowerPoint presentation, and you can see it on your own. And if you want to do your own research, that will help as well. And then finally, with availability, how do we increase the availability of something? Well, this is where we call it fault tolerance. And those two words mean something specific. Fault means something failed. Tolerance means I can protect against it. So it's the practice of preventing a failure from disrupting the availability of something. And here are some examples. On the left-hand side, I have redundancy, which is copying or having a separate path for something. And then fault tolerance is for uh, directly preventing something from failing. Okay. RAID, I will probably create a single lesson just on RAID. It's that important. But this is hard drives, hard drives that you use in your computer. So this is redundancy and fault tolerance depending on which version you choose. There's load balancing. And very quickly, what I mean by that is, let's say I have a web server. Okay. If I have a web server by itself and it goes down, well, then I can't serve my clients that website. So if I want to increase the availability by using a load balancer, what I would do is I would have two web servers that have the same exact information. Okay, they have the same website and the same data, and I put a load balancer in between them. And it is what faces the internet to what my clients connect to. So when my clients connect to that load balancer and say, hey, I want to get to this person's website, at random, it's going to point my client to one of the two web servers. That way, it divides the load between the two. And if one happens to fail, then the load balancer can intelligently move everybody from the failed web server over to the good one, giving me time to replace the failed web server. Okay. Failover clustering is similar but different. I know that's a little confusing, and clustering in and of itself is massively confusing. But let's just call it load balancing on steroids. Okay, that's really what it is. And what with a load balancer, you're usually talking about two devices. Usually, sometimes three. And if you have third, that's what's called a hot spare. When we talk about clustering, you could have thousands. You can have thousands of devices that serve the same thing. So if I'm talking about a website or a web server, I could have thousands of servers that the only thing they do is serve that specific website. So when somebody connects to the website, it all works intelligently. So if a bunch of those 1,000 servers fail, as long as it's not a certain amount, depending on the type of clustering that you choose, the website will stay up and running. And it doesn't have to point to anybody. It works intelligently. We'll just call it that. High availability pairs, that is similar to load balancing, but for hardware networking devices. And then we have redundant power and network. And if you already know about uninterruptible power supplies, that's not what I'm talking about when I say redundant power. What I mean is that, let's say you have a computer or a server, you hook it up to two different power circuits. Okay, these special servers have two power supplies, so you could plug one of the connections of the power supply into one power circuit and the other one into another power circuit. So, for example, let's say you have your power provider like PG&E, and then you have, say, a solar panel or whatever, or battery. Battery backup's probably a bad example, but anyway, you have two sources of power. One of the whole sources of power could fail, like PG&E could just go out, and the server won't know the difference. It'll just keep running forever. And then on the right side, I have replication, cloud, and monitoring. And that's exactly what you might think it is. Replication means copying data. Cloud means storing extra data in the internet. And then monitoring is being able to get alerted when something bad happens. So backups and snapshots. Backups, we usually talk about very slow, where you're taking a backup in time of a device like a server. When we talk about snapshots, we're usually talking about virtual machines. Yes, I will talk about that in another lesson. And what a snapshot does is in a couple seconds, it makes a very quick backup of that server. And it works in a very specific way, which is why it's so fast. Database replication. Database is a very complex spreadsheet, but with a database, a bunch of people use it at the same time, and the database mechanism will replicate that data to a bunch of other servers. Multi-region deployments, and this specifically talks about cloud. So let's say I have an Azure account through Microsoft or AWS through Amazon. Well, I'm here in California and I need a virtual server. They're probably going to give me a server that's located in California. Well, let's pretend that Amazon has a region outage, which is rare, but it happens, and every single server in California, for example, is not available. Well, with a multi-region deployment, I could have copies of my server sent to other states in other regions so that my customers can still be served. I'm going to pay more, but it's more important for me to serve my customers than to lose money. So I will gladly pay for that extra protection. Kubernetes, that is a very long word for specific technology, but it is basically a self-healing virtual server, and I will cover that later. DDoS, and I will, just like RAID, I will probably have a whole lesson that talks about DDoS on its own. And what it stands for is distributed denial of service. If you've ever heard of a massive attack against a bank or an internet service provider or some massive company on the internet, chances are it was done through a DDoS. And what happens is you have a malicious attacker or group of attackers that create a very complex virus that goes out to a ton of people that have no idea that they have this virus. And this virus is programmed to go off at a specific time, which we call a Trojan horse. And let's say, on Christmas, it doesn't matter, but pick a day, New Year's Eve. This virus will attack a specific victim that the attacker wants to hit. And so you have thousands upon thousands, possibly millions of computers infected with this virus that attack a single company. And what the point of this is to damage the company's reputation. Because if a company gets hit with a DDoS, one, their networking equipment is going to go down, and at every minute that they're down, it's going to cost them money. And they usually are legally obligated to report that failure to the public to let them know that happened. And so it's nothing but problems. So you actually have companies out there that their whole business model is to protect companies against DDoS, and they make a ton of money. So if you want to make a ton of money, make your own DDoS protection company. I'm kidding. Nobody I know has that kind of computer power. But hey, it's an idea. UPS generators and HVAC, that's where the battery backup comes in. And we all know what these are. UPS is an uninterruptible power supply. We're not talking about the Brown Shipping Company. Uh, with a UPS, literally the whole purpose of a UPS is to provide enough power on backup battery long enough for an administrator to safely shut down that device. It is not designed to run anything for a long amount of time. So if let's say you have your computer at home, you may have a $60 UPS. Okay, it'll provide your computer a few hours of protection if your power goes out. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but if you need longer protection, you may have a generator that's hooked up to your entire house, or solar panels, for example. Companies that invest in these technologies literally invest millions of dollars in these protection equipment. They have thousands of UPSs connected to the same equipment. They have generators. They have power from different power companies. They have solar and so on and so forth. And the HVAC is specifically for servers and very powerful networking equipment because they generate a lot of heat. We all know about AI and how much water those use to cool the supercomputers that they run on. Well, prior to supercooling through water and freezing, it was just a smaller version of HVAC, which is um, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And then we have what's called SIEM or SIME. People call it all sorts of things, but the acronym is SIEM, which is Security, Implementation, and Enterprise Monitoring. That's a mouthful. And what that is visibility and rapid detection of any attackers. So companies that employ and implement an SIEM are usually paying a security company, a cybersecurity company, a lot of money to put these devices in place that monitor all of the networking and computer equipment that they own. And if an attacker gets in and this SIEM series of devices sees that, it will immediately send alerts to whoever it needs to. And depending on the company, it could be anyone from the CEO all the way down to just a regular administrator. So that's the concept of an SIEM. It's extremely costly. So those are the fundamentals of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a world unto its own. I have made my career out of it for the past 10 plus years, and it's served me well. And in this world of AI and very advanced technologies, the more you know about cybersecurity, the better. And if you're a network administrator or a server administrator or you work on computers, it doesn't matter what you do in the IT world. The more you know about cybersecurity, the better. And additionally, you can protect yourself. And I will go over all the different ways that you can protect yourself and the things that you own personally in future lessons. So I hope that you have enjoyed this content as much as I have in producing it. Thank you for being here. If this helped you, share it with somebody who's learning too. Everything I make is free, and if you want to support the mission, the links are below. I'll see you in the next one.